Riot on the radio, pictures on the TV. Invade a man, take a what he can, shoot out on a silver screen. Sticking 'em up and knocking 'em down, living out a fantasy. There's a bad man cruising around in a big black limousine. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. And in my humble opinion, the new Naked Gun, it's pretty good. And anybody who watches this channel frequently enough knows that I'm a huge movie snob. I can't help it. I just know what I like. I'm fairly confident about what I think is good. And in situations much like this one, I can very rarely mask the utter disdain I feel for the concept of a legacy sequel and film franchises that go on for way too long and where whatever creative direction is there has nothing original or inventive to contribute, especially in a case like this where we're getting a legacy sequel to a comedy franchise of all things, where the last entry in that franchise came out 31 years ago, and I was only just 2 years old at the time. Stuff like that. I'm just not the sort of person who's going to bother seeing that sort of thing unless I'm doing a series like this and I have some anticipation that this is going to be the main event apparent in terms of latest weekend releases. But then I have to remember that while I wasn't even born when the original Naked Gun came out, not just that, but pretty much all of those Liam Neeson parody star vehicles were major comedy staples of my childhood. Whereas I can just go on YouTube and search Naked Gun reaction and find hundreds of movie reaction channels, many of them featuring people my age or even older, who never saw Naked Gun, attach no nostalgia to it, and it's like, dude, how the fuck did you never see the original Naked Gun growing up? So consider the opening of this entry of the New Movie Diary a special how the fuck have you never seen this memo to everyone who is seeing that trailer where now Liam Neeson is saying he's Frank Drebin, Police Squad, the new version, and have no idea what's going on. So The Naked Gun was a movie from 1988 created by the comedy team of brothers Jerry and David Zucker and childhood friend Jim Abrahams, who previous to that film had already established themselves as among the biggest names behind the camera in terms of American film comedy. They burst onto the scene in 1977 by writing the John Landis-directed sketch anthology, The Kentucky Fried Movie, before going on to write and direct Airplane, which came out in 1980, that movie also being notable as being the first time that they worked with actor Leslie Nielsen. The Naked Gun, which originated Nielsen in the starring role as Detective Frank Drebin of Police Squad, in turn was a spin-off of a short-lived comedy series Police Squad, which was not successful upon its original airing on ABC, but subsequently developed a cult following, and The Naked Gun itself proved so successful that it spawned 2 sequels. With that resume, the team of Zucker, Abrahams, Zucker, or Zaz, basically made themselves synonymous with spoof movies, comedy parodies of established genres, in this case the detective and crime and action films, that combined classic slapstick and sometimes even downright vaudevillian routines with visual gags and pun and non-sequitur-laden dialogue, but where the most crucial element that they discovered in their collaboration with Leslie Nielsen, who was not known as a comedic actor before these films, was a deadpan approach to the humor, where no matter how absurd the gags got, Nielsen and the other actors continued to play everything more or less completely straight, almost never acknowledging the absurdity. You personally might not have ever seen Airplane or The Naked Gun growing up, but if the Scary Movie franchise was a staple of your younger and teenage millennial years, you should know that the Wayans brothers owe a huge debt of gratitude in their sense of humor to the spoof stylings of Zaz. Hell, if you're a big Family Guy and Seth MacFarlane fan, well, I got news for you. If you like Ted and A Million Ways to Die in the West, you probably wouldn't have any of that without The Naked Gun, which I guess makes it appropriate that some 3 decades after the release of the last Naked Gun film, and nearly 15 years following the passing of original actor Leslie Nielsen, that it is, in fact, Seth MacFarlane who is producing this official legacy sequel to the original film. The new Naked Gun thus stars Liam Neeson, himself a dramatic actor who, in more recent years, has been primarily known for B action and thriller parts that themselves serve as the basis for the very genre this movie is spoofing. Not unlike Nielsen before him, there might even be a little nominative determinism at work here, like Leslie Nielsen, Liam Neeson. I'm sure I'm going to mix up those names at some point in doing this. Anyway, Liam Neeson stars as Frank Drebin Jr., a lieutenant and lead detective of LA's Special Branch Police Squad, and the son of the original Frank Drebin, having apparently inherited all of his father's recklessness, stupidity, and lack of anything approaching self-awareness. And the story, again, follows basically a boilerplate detective thriller plot in which an apparent suicide investigation leads the hard-nosed old-school detective into a shady conspiracy being perpetrated by a rich entrepreneur and socialite played by Danny Houston. Himself not a terrible pick for a deadpan turn at a B-movie villain part that he's portrayed countless times before, and of course, Drebin further becomes embroiled in a romantic affair with the sister of the man whose death he's investigating, that being Beth Davenport, played by Pamela Anderson. So if you're the sort of person who has no personal connection to The Naked Gun or that kind of spoof movie, and you're just going to see this mid-budget comedy on a weekend, I can tell you that you're in good hands. If you're the sort of person who prefers these sorts of comedies that are more about the gags than about the plot or the stars, which might strike some as a strange qualifier to make until, again, you go by some of these movie reaction channels and discover that whether it's Zaz or Monty Python or classic Mel Brooks comedies, there really are a lot of people who just don't vibe with that sort of movie, who even find all of those puns and non sequiturs to be more annoying rather than funny. It does occur to me that it wasn't too long ago that a show like South Park did a whole 2-part extravaganza in which they were specifically taking pot shots at Seth MacFarlane and Family Guy on exactly that sort of basis, where they were able to acknowledge why those sorts of comedy TV and movies could get so popular, while at the same time being very stalwart about how much they loathe what MacFarlane and his output represented in terms of a style of comedy that never really tried to tell a compelling character-based story, but was just an excuse for gags. But for those of us who do have a personal connection to those Zaz spoofs, I think there is something that still needs to be said for the art of a comedy that isn't narrative or character-based, especially in an era where folks like Judd Apatow and his own frat pack cohort have themselves established a style of comedy that has dominated American culture for the better part of a decade, where the narrative and character elements often feel so phoned in, but in addition, so much of the comedy is simply based around improvisational or improvisational seeming dialogue rather than any actual gags that play upon and subvert the expectations of the audience. The original Naked Gun is a masterclass in the gag comedy, and as a legacy sequel to that classic, I think a lot of praise is owed to the creative team behind The Naked Gun, because it's not only a funny gag movie in its own right, filled with great visual spoofs and puns and non sequiturs, all complemented by a deadpan style in which nobody in the movie ever has like a well, that just happened, or, well, that was random moment, but everyone just commits to playing the absurdity of the film completely straight. I don't just think this new Naked Gun is a solid gag comedy in its own right, but as a legacy sequel to a classic Naked Gun, it must be said that the people behind the camera and working on this script really have done a superb job of emulating the spirit of those classic Zaz spoofs, such that the best thing about it is that it kind of underscores, even after so many comedy writers and directors and actors have been directly influenced by the Zaz spoofs in their own work throughout the years, still how few of those works of TV and film really ever feel quite like the original Naked Gun, in terms of that sense that there's like this liberating anarchy to it, where whether you're laughing or groaning at the obviousness of a gag, you're still appreciating the fact that while this movie is indebted and pays such obvious homage to a now classic comedy film, it still on its own feels refreshing, because you realize how we oftentimes just don't seem to get comedies like this anymore, or at least not ones that are as this well made, not just from a writing perspective, but also from a technical perspective. The director of the new Naked Gun is Akiva Schaffer, who, besides being part of the Lonely Island crew alongside Andy Samberg and Jorma Taccone, himself has a long career resume in sketch comedy, stretching from his consistent work with Saturday Night Live to his own films with Samberg and Taccone, including the cult classics Hot Rod and Popstar, neither of which I have seen. I know, right? How the tables have turned. I can already hear people retching like, dude, how the fuck have you never seen Hot Rod? My point is that Schaffer turns out to be an excellent pick to helm this project, because it means that, like the original film, The Naked Gun isn't just resting on some funny bits of dialogue or an inspired visual gag here and there. The filmmaking itself, from a technical perspective, serves the interests of the spoof, right down to the fact that more than pretty much any other crime or cop comedy that I can remember, it actually looks like the sort of thing it's spoofing, which turns out to be so essential in terms of overcoming the lack of any real relation to the narrative being so important, or us being invested in the characters emotionally, such that it perhaps illustrates that one of the most important things that a spoof or gag comedy can do is really immerse you in the deadpan environment of that genre, to do its best to make every other element that isn't just a fulcrum for a gag feel like it could be taken right out of a straight cop or detective flick. Now, I'm not about to tell you that this new Naked Gun holds a candle to the original, much less that it even ranks for me among the funniest spoof or gag movies in recent memory. Besides the Zaz originals, this new Naked Gun has a lot to contend with in terms of the fact that there have simply been so many filmmakers who have already soldiered on in the spirit of Abraham Zucker, but without having to pay direct homage or carry on the legacy of their films. The new Naked Gun is definitely a funny movie, and probably one of the better comedies you're going to see this year, especially in the direct-to-streaming slop era of post-frat pack comedy we're still mired in. But even if you've never had any particular connection or affinity to those Zaz spoofs, it might not be long before you're already comparing Naked Gun in your mind to, say, Adam McKay's earlier work on Anchorman and Talladega Nights, or David Wayne's own Wet Hot American Summer and They Came Together, or who could neglect mentioning Walk Hard, perhaps one of the few gag or spoof movies to actually best the classic Zaz features. To say nothing of Phil Lord and Chris Miller's 21 and 22 Jump Street, which, let's be real, those are going to be the movies that McFarlane and Schaffer's Naked Gun is going to be living in the shadow of far more than the 1988 original. The new Naked Gun is only a great spoof or gag movie if your primary cultural memory for this kind of comedy is, as it is for me, unfortunately mired in the trauma of how the filmmakers who took on the most overt and deliberate mantle of the Zaz legacy were the Wayans brothers, who, while they themselves made some quite funny spoof movies in their own right, their own spoof movies definitely ended up following a trend in which cleverness in terms of creating visual gags or twisting lines of dialogue in ironic ways gave way to just basically the most obvious kind of toilet or the laziest forms of slapstick humor, and, of course, references, just throwing as many timely and doomed to be dated pop culture references into your movie as possible. And while the Wayans probably did just enough good stuff in their own style to not be the worst offenders at this, they are indirectly responsible for collaborating with and thus co-signing the hacks du jour of the spoof comedy, Jason Friedberg and Aaron Seltzer, whose reign of terror is seemingly happily at an end, but let's be real, stuff like Meet the Spartans and Superhero Movie, the latter of which was even produced by David Zucker. Christ almighty, it wasn't just that they were terrible comedies so much as it is that they were so terrible and so synonymous with movie spoofs for so long that you'd be forgiven if you felt as though they killed off that entire style of comedy completely. The new Naked Gun is practically a masterpiece just because spoof and gag movies have been broadly terrible for so long. But that doesn't really change the fact that there's still this sense of hollowness to the whole thing, because on the one hand, it's a legacy media project that, just like with 21 Jump Street before it, at least attempts to paint as part of the comedy the inherent absurdity of the attempt to revive this dead franchise itself, and more especially making this very obvious thematic move to make part of the updated spoof of Naked Gun that Liam Neeson is part of this cohort of old guys who appeal to this trope of crusty and stubborn old jerks showing the younger generation how it's done, and if it ain't broke, don't fix it. It's all part of the joke on how many action heroes, especially B action heroes, are just old fucks, where there's this absurd agenda to reinvigorate older or more traditional values of masculinity by just taking some dude who should be resting in a rocking chair on a porch and making him mow down an entire team of assassins or whatever. Except that the new Naked Gun is clearly too overtly an homage and not a send-up of the original Naked Gun, and more so it's also an homage to a style of comedy that, at the time, the original Naked Gun was a timely spoof of cliches in cop movies and TV. Everything from classic Hollywood noir to Dirty Harry to shows like Dragnet and countless other cop shows. The well from which Zaz were drawing from in their spoofs might not have always been timely in the sense of all that media being current to the exact moment, but in the late 80s, this was still the time before prestige TV, where television was a major vector for American families to just vegetate in front of the boob tube and watch whatever was on. And what was on was often a healthy mix of current and old stuff, so that anybody could go see The Naked Gun in theaters and, understand why Leslie Nielsen is morbidly narrating throughout the whole thing, and then there's a joke about how his internal monologue runs out of steam or something. Look, there's a reason that movie reaction channels are so popular, because it's not just for people like me to get to see somebody who has never seen the original Naked Gun finally see it and react in real time. It's that movie reaction channels on YouTube are basically some of the only mainstream vehicles for which folks of this generation are even ever being exposed to old stuff, so that you can have this shared lexicon of pop culture tropes that can be timely to the moment if it's a spoof, but still be timeless in the sense that you don't expect that the legibility of those tropes is likely to change in some major way. But the running internal monologue of a hardened vigilante detective is a trope that has gone virtually extinct in recent cop and detective shows, and more importantly, the audience is not being exposed to those tropes anymore because all we have is new stuff. The new Naked Gun does make a valiant effort to update the formula, especially with regards to the stunt casting of Nielsen himself as basically the sort of B-action hero character that has been his bread and butter, now being played for laughs. But overall, there is this sense that for however refreshing it is as a definitive example of the spoof comedy, it also feels so out of time and place. It's like the essential comedic bedrock of the movie is so deep down because the whole film is a grand homage to a really old movie, and to a really old movie that itself was basically playing on really deep cultural touchstones that not only aren't terribly timely anymore for a spoof, but also thus lose their feeling of being timeless. Quite frankly, the best aspects of the new Naked Gun, for, again, as funny as it is, don't have anything to do with the comedy. I don't think I can express enough how, in combination of Liam Neeson and Pamela Anderson's absolutely remarkable chemistry as actors and Akiva Schaffer's technical proficiency in terms of taking this spoof of a cop and crime movie, and no matter what setting they're in, whether it's a more modern CSI kind of riff or something more like a gritty Chris Nolan directed tactile action sequence, or, of course, a classic noir setting complete with the femme fatale and Pamela Anderson meeting the once-bitten, twice-shy detective in Neeson in the hallway of this flop apartment with a window in the back showing, instead of a digital composite, what looks like a classic practical backlighting of a painted backdrop of the LA sunset. Also that, if not for the gags, the whole movie feels like it could have come right out of whatever genre of cop movie is being spoofed here. I can't really express enough how all of that works together to achieve something in moments that even the original Zaz classic didn't even bother with for as technically well-crafted and well-acted in that deadpan sense as they were. It achieves a real sense of romantic gravitas and atmosphere, such that, look, I think Leslie Nielsen and Priscilla Presley were a great deadpan comedic pairing. They worked really well together. But you never bought them as a couple, because that wasn't the point. That was never part of the point. It's just a fulcrum of cliches to serve as a gag, especially that cliche of this older, gristly Robert Mitchum-esque actor being paired with this younger, much conventionally hotter woman. But Neeson and Anderson here, they have, actually great chemistry with one another, such that no matter how absurd what they're saying is, you absolutely buy this kind of intimate connection that is forming between them, that it isn't essential or anything. It wouldn't have needed to happen to make the gag stream run. But since it is there, it takes what would have otherwise been a pretty funny but otherwise disposable or gratuitous legacy comedy and turns it into something that really has a sweet, earnest, emotional core that draws you in. And look, I'm aware that apparently during the making of this movie, something genuine was going on between Anderson and Neeson, that they are now seeing each other as a couple. But good acting is good acting. Good romantic chemistry is good romantic chemistry. And Schaffer's technical craftsmanship around this pair is something that no amount of comparison to either the original Naked Gun or the contemporary spoof and gag comedy writers and directors that have preceded him with their own, honestly much funnier works, is gonna undo. There are a lot of gag and spoof movies from recent years that are way funnier than the new Naked Gun. But I'm gonna tell you something. None of them have a pair of romantic leads that actually feels convincing. None of them has a gracefully aging man paired with a gracefully aging woman just coming together and looking into each other's eyes in this immaculately warm LA noir lighting and making you think, yeah, these two are destined to be together. This is probably getting a little out of pocket, but The whole story behind how Neeson went from being this internationally acclaimed dramatic actor to doing one B schlock actioner after another, this is something he's more or less admitted to in interviews himself. After the untimely death of his first wife, Natasha Richardson, he just dove into work as an escape and wasn't too discriminating about what he took. And in classic grizzled cop mode, here Neeson is playing Frank Drebin Jr., who's still mourning the untimely passing of his own wife before Anderson's character wanders into his life and beguiles him. Look, there's a lot of weird fucking stuff going on underneath the hood of this movie, so really weird art imitating life, imitating art shtick. But I digress, I have my qualms, but I still do think this is a funny, well-executed spoof comedy. I'm giving The Naked Gun a fair 3 out of 5. With that, I'm tapping out. Thank you so much for sticking through this whole vid. Don't be a stranger to sounding off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm going to catch you guys next time.